Welcome to the Bookish Introverts podcast. Join host Amazon bestselling author Brett Nelson and avid reader Melanie Dyer as they dive in to review books they've read, then chat with the amazing authors behind them. Quiet minds, big bookshelves. You don't want to miss it.
Hey friends, this is Brett and Melanie, and we are back for another fun bookish discussion. On the podcast, so far we've discussed books that we've enjoyed, but today we're doing something a little bit different for the very first time. On our first podcast, we focused our discussion on The Woman from Lydia. It's a book by Angela Hunt, and Melanie's the one that recommended the book. And even though I'm typically not a fan of historical fiction, I fell in love with this book.
You did.
Yeah. Were you surprised?
I was a little surprised. Yeah.
Yeah. And so after we did the podcast episode, I told Melanie, I was like, oh my goodness, we have got to email Angela and see if we can get her to come on the podcast. And guess what? I did.
You did.
And you know that little scripture that says, ask and you shall receive?
Ask and you shall receive.
We asked and we received. So before we bring Angela on, we do have her with us here today. Before we get started, do you have a little bio?
I have a little bit.
Tell us a little bit about her.
We did a little bit of a bio on the first one, but there's some other little things that I found in here that I found interesting. So she has sold over 5 million copies, which again is crazy to me. I'm just so impressed of her books. 150 books. Also crazy. I can't even get one written. So I'm so impressed with that.
Yeah.
She and her husband live in Florida. They are dog lovers. I'm also a dog lover. I have a dog. She's very sweet. She's crazy, but she's very sweet. And I did notice that you learned to flirt by reading Gone with the Wind.
Oh, yes.
I love that. I wrote a sentence in school using a vocabulary word from Gone with the Wind, and my teacher got a kick out. I think I was in second grade. I love Gone with the Wind, so that really that stuck out to me. She's won the Christie Award, several Angel Awards, gold and silver medallions, just all the awards. The Note was a Christmas movie on the Hallmark Channel. I think Brett has seen it. I don't believe I have.
Did not realize it was written by her. So that's cool.
And she has a Master of Biblical Studies in Theology degree, which is also very impressive to me. I try to study biblical things and I get confused easily. So that's just crazy. Got a doctorate in biblical studies in 2008. And she also does writing workshops and writing conferences. So she's just kind of a Jill of all trades, really.
Very, very busy.
A very busy woman. And we're very grateful to her for taking time out of that busy schedule to be here with us.
We are so excited. So shall we bring her on? Okay, so Angela Hunt, welcome to our podcast. We are so grateful to have you here.
Yes, thank you so much for coming on our podcast.
Oh, well, thank you. And thank you for having me. It's great to talk with y'all again.
So you have a bachelor's and a master's in theology. I'm wondering, did you seek those degrees in order to better equip yourself to write your biblical fiction? Or did you already have the degrees when you first started writing?
Well, actually, I got my bachelor's in English. So in college, I was just a straight English major. I went to Liberty University and it was still in its fledgling stage. And they didn't have a specific, creative writing major or journalism major. So, English it was. And so I wrote many books and for many years. And then one day I wanted to write a book about God's sovereignty, a novel. And it hit me. Oh my goodness, you'd better know what you're talking about. And I realized I always try to learn something new myself in each novel that I'm writing. And so it just occurred to me that I had to know really for sure how to approach these kind of heavy doctrinal issues, because I don't want to stand before the Lord and hear that I got it wrong. So I went back and got a doctorate in I got my master's in theology proper, and then I went and got a doctorate in biblical studies, and then another one in theology proper, a THD. So I'm still learning. I'm taking Hebrew at my local Messianic synagogue. So all this stuff comes in very handy.
Oh, I love that. Okay, so according to your website, you've written around 165 books. Do you know exactly how many you've written at this point?
The last time I counted, I think it was 165 or 166. But, there's always something. I'm always working on something. So I never know quite how to count.
I know you write historical or biblical fiction, and you also have some contemporary fiction books. What else is in your repertoire in that 165 books? Do you write other genres as well?
Oh, sure. I started out with children's picture books. In fact, my first published book was because I won a contest with 4 children's picture book writers that were unpublished.
Was that The Three Trees?
No, it was a book called If I Had Long, Long Hair.
Oh, okay. The reason I ask is I actually realized after the first time we talked to you that I actually have a picture book of The Three Trees on my bookshelf. Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah. I didn't realize at the time that you had written that, but yeah. So anyway, yeah.
Yeah. And my husband was a middle school youth pastor. And so then I started writing middle grade books for those kids, fiction and nonfiction. And I've done a lot of as told to stories for celebrities and nonfiction, a couple parenting. I had a Christmas Advent book released last year that I was really excited about. I love doing the research for that. And I really believe that being a writer is like being a builder. And as long as you know how to use the tools and you study the blueprint for that particular genre, you can write anything. And I really don't see the point in confining yourself just to one genre. I understand why publishers like you to publish just in one genre, because readers come back to you kind of expecting the same sort of thing. But I would get bored if I wrote just the same thing all the time.
Oh, that is so true. But in all the writers' conferences I've attended, one thing that they bang into our heads is that you have to find your lane and stay in it. And I don't do a very good job of staying in my own lane. As an author, I like to write different types of stories. So do you think it's okay for authors to dabble in different genres?
Yes, but you have to recognize that some readers, like I have historical readers that won't read my contemporaries, and I have contemporary people who think that historical is boring. So you almost have to write 3 or 4 times as much to make a name for yourself as you would if you did stick to one lane. So that's just the fact of the business, because so much depends upon the marketing and what's hot at the moment. And there was a time when biblical fiction was hot, and then biblical fiction is like on a pendulum. And one season it's hot, and then it's not, and then it swings back again. I wrote a series of a trilogy about Joseph back in the late 80s, I think. And it was hot because the Red Tent had come out about the same time in the general market. And then that faded and it wasn't hot anymore. And then it came back again. And I think a lot of that has to do with the success of The Chosen. So at the moment, biblical fiction is hot, but it's also almost being too popular. I mean, all of a sudden, everybody's writing biblical fiction. And then the market's going to become saturated. And I predict in a few years after The Chosen completes, I think it will go back to being not hot again. So when you've been around as long as I have, you kind of see the trends in the way that things work.
So when the time comes that biblical fiction isn't hot, do you think you'll quit writing that genre and focus on something else for a while and then go back to it at some point in the future?
I probably won't, just because I'm kind of running out of things to write about. Yeah, I hate writing stories that everybody else has already covered. So I like doing people that nobody's really done before, or trying to find a way to do them that nobody's ever done them. For instance, right now I'm working on a trilogy, a series on the matriarchs. And I think mine will be different from any of the others, because I've been worshiping at a Messianic synagogue for over a year. So I can bring a lot of the Jewish perspective to it, even though Abraham was not Jewish. He didn't speak Hebrew because, he was number one, the first one. And so, but I also found an ancient manuscript that's not inspired by any means, but it gives a lot of the backstory into Abraham and Sarah that I can use. And I doubt that anybody else has even found it. So, yeah.
Was biblical historical fiction always a favorite of yours? And did reading it influence your decision to start writing fiction set in biblical times?
Not really. I have always liked historical fiction. My favorite books as a kid were Gone with the Wind, Jane Eyre, Little Women. The Nun story is my favorite novel of all time. And it was set in World War II. It was not historical fiction when it was written, but it is historical fiction now. So I do love the history. And so I appreciate biblical fiction as historical fiction, not only because it's biblical. In fact, I almost don't like the term biblical fiction because it seems like an oxymoron. If it's biblical, how can it be fiction?
True.
Yeah. But at the same time,
how can it be fiction?
Yeah. So
True.
I tend to call if people ask me what I write, I said, I write at the moment historical fiction set in biblical times. Yeah. Yeah.
Biblical times.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. But
that makes
sense.
clarity.
Yeah. Yes.
And a lot of people think that biblical fiction is just taking the Bible and amplifying it, where I use every historical document I can find. And like in my book on Esther, I did a lot of research on Xerxes and his Greek campaign and the other queen that was in the palace, whether you call her Vashti or Emetrius or whatever her name was. So I don't just use the Bible. It's my touchstone, but I use so much more because there's a lot going on in the world at that time, and I think it's silly not to use it.
Yeah, if it's got resources there.
And you can tell that when you're reading your books, you can tell that there was a lot of research that went into that, because you're pulling stuff that isn't in the Bible. The curse tablets, for one thing, I'm sure were a thing that existed. It doesn't surprise me at all.
Oh, yeah.
As an author, one thing that I've found that can be very hard sometimes is to find the time to read for pleasure. Do you make it a priority to find the time to read?
Oh, my goodness. It's so hard these days to even find time to read, which is one reason why I've always tried to be in a book club. In my previous house, I started a neighborhood book club because being in a book club forces me to read a novel a month, which keeps me reading for pleasure. And so then we moved and I was without one. So I started one with a group of writer friends, which is really interesting because we sit around and analyze things like, what would you have done differently? Well, I would have done this and this and this and this. And I didn't like the way that, anyway, we are a tough group. We're a tough audience. I know.
Oh my gosh. I so get that. I know for me, since I've become an author, it kind of makes reading for pleasure so much harder because I find myself reading and thinking, ooh, I wouldn't have done it that way. Or, ooh, I wouldn't have written that sentence that way. So do you find yourself doing the same thing when you're reading? Do you with against your will, find yourself going into editor mode when you're reading other people's work?
Yes, there's an inner editor, and I notice mistakes immediately. And if there's too many of them, I can't read it because it's exhausting. But if I find a really good story that gets me caught up in the story, then my little editor just zips her lip, and I'm able to read. Yeah.
Next, I want to talk about your emissary books, which have a heavy presence of slavery, which of course was very common in the days of the past. Readers today tend to be, I think, overly sensitive about things, so slavery has the potential to be offensive to certain readers in today's society. When you began writing these books, were you ever worried that writing about such a tough subject might be offensive to some readers, or do you just try not to dwell on things like that?
Yeah, I tend to want to go with truth no matter what. A friend of mine wrote a book set in the Civil War era, and her editor, they had already printed the book, and they sent it to some sensitivity readers, and they said, we don't like the way this slave woman is depicted here. She needs to be given agency and free will so she can rise above her situation. And then my friend said, I can't write it like that because that is not what it was like. And she would not have had agency, free agency back then. So she pulled the book. But I don't, because I'm not going to submit to a woke crowd who wants me to change history. I really believe in sticking to the truth of the way things were. And I think that's why historical readers read historical fiction. But really the point of that book well, first of all, it was an inescapable fact. There were more slaves in Rome than there were free people. And so you've got to deal with it. It was just, and the people considered it part of their normal lives. And the slaves in Rome were generally well treated to a point. I mean, you always had cruel masters, but a lot of times they were considered family members. And I know I'm sounding like a Civil War slave owner, but it's true. Because in those days, occasionally when a man, the paterfamilias of a family died, he would give his slaves freedom, or certain slaves. So the slaves were motivated to do well and to earn their master's favor. And I'm not excusing slavery, but the whole point of that book was, and anytime I mention slaves, is that we are supposed to be slaves to Jesus Christ. And so I'm not saying that slavery is a bad thing in the light of we don't really have free agency if we are believers, because we are to submit our will to Jesus Christ. And so that is what Mariana in the book has to come to terms with is, she wants to do this and that and the other, but ultimately she has to think, okay, what would Jesus do? WWJD. She's got to come to points with that. And every character in the book has to come to that point, whether they accept the lordship of Jesus Christ, or if they reject it. So that was my point, and my point of having so many slaves play an active part in the story. It's sort of a theme.
True. And I actually think it's healthy to delve into tougher subjects in our reading, topics that might be a little bit uncomfortable. As an author, I find the trigger warning craze a little bit out of control, though I do realize they can be important in some instances. But I think in some ways it demonstrates just how soft our society has become. It's almost like some readers are terrified to feel anything that might draw out a tough emotion, so they need trigger warnings to prevent it. And as a reader, I just don't think that's healthy. What do you think about that?
Yeah. Our society today has become the wimpiest. I mean, we have to be warned. Oh, you might get your feelings hurt. And for heaven's sake, the world is a tough place. And in, the first century was extremely tough. But no, I do not believe in covering things up or sugarcoating anything. And the third book, I've finished the third book in this series already, and it's actually set in Rome. And there were some things that happened there that curled my hair to read about them, but that's the way it was. But I've had some reviewers remark that they didn't want to read the prayers to the goddess, who was the Venus, Aphrodite. because Prima is a devotee of Aphrodite. She goes to the temple and she prays to Aphrodite. That's what they believed. They believed in the gods and goddesses. And Scripture tells us they were actually praying to demons. So I didn't write the prayers so that a reader would think, oh my goodness, I'm praying to a demon, because you're not. You're just reading words on a page. But I respect their sensitivities, but at the same time, I wrote those prayers because I wanted the reader to see that the way she prayed is just the way we pray to God. I mean, you could flip the prayers around and they would still make perfect sense, because those people were as ardent in their prayers to their false gods as we are ardent in our prayers to the true God.
But I think you did a really good job in both books of balancing those characters out, because you had Mariana in Sisters of Corinth, and you had Euodia and Lydia. They were really good. They were super good to their slaves, and then you had Hector in Lydia, and then Prima. And they were like horrible to their slaves. So which was again traditional to that day. So I thought you did a very good job of balancing that out and showing it wasn't, that's just the way it was in those days. And I think readers kind of need to read books like that with the understanding of that's the time.
Yeah, it really was.
It's just the way it was.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily a good thing.
And honestly, what I wrote
it's just
is
the way it
so
was.
far removed from what I could have written. Yeah. Oh,
would you have shocked the pants off
absolutely.
people if you had written to the true?
Yeah. For instance, in that book, in the book we're talking about, Sisters of Corinth, I originally had Prima beating to death that one slave. I forget her name, but she came to warn Gilda. I had her beating.
Gilda?
She had Gilda beaten to death, and my editor said, "Let's not kill her," and said, "I know." I said, "Okay, I'm fine with letting Gilda scrape by." But I mean, she would have had every right to have her slave beaten to death because she was her property.
Yeah.
Yes,
and that is just such an odd. To say that anybody's your property, like that is such an odd. Like I can't believe there was a time when people viewed other people as their property. That's just amazing to me.
It's difficult for us to understand.
Well,
with
it's
our
still
sensibilities.
Yeah,
but it's still
we've
going
been taught.
On.
No,
I mean, there's slave trafficking.
It does still go on,
and people trafficking, and people who are assuming ownership of other people. It's evil and it's sinful, but people are at their core nature evil and sinful. It's a depraved world.
Yeah. And I guess we're kind of in our little Christian bubble or here. So sometimes I forget that stuff like that still exists in the world. And then you watch movies like The Sound of Freedom and you're like, oh my goodness, this is still going on.
Yes. Eye-opening, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It was very eye-opening. Yeah.
I have not seen it. My husband has, but I haven't seen it yet.
Well, I saw it on Prime. If you have Prime, it used to be on Prime. I don't.
He's wanted to watch it with me, but I haven't.
Yeah, I have movies like that.
Can you tell us what, if anything, you are reading right now?
Reading? Yes, I just finished my book club. Just finished a book called The Dilemma. It was a contemporary novel on a very small canvas, and most of it took place within 24 hours. And we read it as an exercise to see how this author kept suspense going through the whole book. So even though it was in a small set, within 24 hours, the husband had a secret and the wife had a secret, and big secrets, and they didn't want to tell each other, but they needed to. So it was all about tension and suspense. So it was very good in that aspect. Yeah.
Ooh, that sounds like a great read. I may have to check that one out. So is that Christian fiction or is that secular fiction?
No, it's secular fiction.
Ah, gotcha. Even though we mostly talk about Christian fiction here on the podcast, at times we'll still discuss secular fiction books. even though we enjoy Christian fiction, I still enjoy secular fiction too. I think it's just good to read a mix of both because it gives us a more rounded reading experience. Okay, so I'd like to switch gears here for a minute, if you don't mind. I want to talk about being a New York Times bestselling author. As an author, I think I can say that is the list most authors dream of making. So tell us about your experience with that. When did you first make the New York Times bestseller list? What book was it? How did you find out that you made the list? Do you have to check the list every week, or did someone call and tell you? I'm just kind of interested to hear how that happened for you.
Well, actually, I feel like I can't take a lot of credit for it because it wasn't on one of my original stories. It was on a book that I wrote with and for Deanna Favre, Brett Favre's wife. In fact, I'm not a football fan. I don't follow football. I don't know who anybody is. And my editor had emailed me. And so my husband was in the next room and I hollered. I said, "Hey, honey, do you know who Brett Favre is?" And he was howling. And, but
I bet he was like, "Brett Favre, are you crazy?"
Yeah. But she needed a writer to tell the story, her breast cancer story. And so I was hired to do that. And that hit the New York Times list. And I think some of my other As Told To books may have done so as well. But honestly, I can't remember.
Gosh, that's so cool. So how did you find out about that? Did you just keep checking the New York Times bestseller list to see if you had made it or what?
No, my editor tells me, yeah.
And the thing about the New York Times bestseller list is that it really is just a popularity contest. An author can totally meet all the criteria for making the list, and they still won't make it unless the New York Times likes you and wants you to be on their list, which really kind of sucks if you ask me.
Yeah, well, and it's not completely reliable because the New York Times only counts books sold in certain bookstores. So a book could be selling like hotcakes in some other part of the country and never make it onto the New York Times bestseller list. In fact, somebody, maybe it was James Patterson, just wrote a letter to the world at large about how inaccurate the New York Times list can be. And so, I mean, it's cool, but it's, not on my top 10 list of anything.
Yeah, totally. Okay, now let's discuss editors. Editors are the unsung heroes of every good book. I always say that behind every great book is an even greater editor. In the publishing world, there are various types of editors, everything from beta readers to critique partners to proofreaders to line editors to development editors to copy editors. How many different editors do you get to work with any given novel?
Okay, well, I am traditionally published. I do. If I have a book go out of print, I will self-publish it after I get the rights back. And some of my little smaller books, I self-publish. My writing books that I write for writers, I've self-published. But for my novels, I hand a book in, and it first goes to my substantive editor, who also happens to be the acquisitions editor. In other words, she's the woman who bought the book. And so she reads it, and I think they have at least 2 editors, maybe more, actually read it. And they take about a month, and then they come back and look for big picture suggestions, like don't kill Gilda, or beef up this character some more, or, Prima was into some pretty nasty stuff. And they said, maybe you should pull back a little bit on Prima's activities. And because I tend to say, hey, if you're going to be evil, have her be really, really evil.
Okay, I mean, really, if you're going to commit to being evil, give it your all, right?
Absolutely.
Give it your all.
You know, yeah. But anyway, but you know, you also have to keep your readers' sensibilities in mind, and I'm aware of that. So those, she does not go through and mark line by lines or typos or anything. It's all about story, not the dinky stuff.
Making sure there's no plot holes or stuff like that.
She's very familiar with the Christian reader and what they expect, and my readership, because now she's worked on several of my books, and I think she knows what I'm doing, or, you know, what I'm trying to do. So she sends me a letter with all the suggestions from her and whoever else read it. And they always use the sandwich mode of critique, which is you say several good things, then you say the things that need fixing, and then you say some more nice things and sign off the letter. Oh, yes. I always exactly. In critique groups, I always tell people, use the sandwich approach when you're offering critique on somebody's work. That's right. Yes. You have to keep them willing to sit at the desk.
Yes.
Because I have received letters that just made me want to sit in the corner and go. Yeah, but anyway, so then I usually have about a month to make those changes, and I send it back in. And then it goes to the line editor, and he is the one who goes through line by line to make sure that it's clear and it's legible and it's clean and stylistic things. Every publishing house has a Bible, lowercase b, of the way they like things done. Like, do they capitalize the word scripture? Some do, some don't. Do they capitalize, you know, they're little dinky typographical kinds of things. And so they make sure that everything is in the publishing house style, because every publisher has a different style. And I have a tendency, in my writers online group, we're always debating semicolons in fiction. I believe in semicolons. Long live the semicolon, because I talk in semicolons. In this sentence right here, I have put several semicolons. You just can't see them. And then other people say, no, there should be a period or whatever. And I'm like, but I talk in semicolons, so my characters are going to talk in semicolons. But a lot of my semicolons get taken out at this stage just because, you know.
In working with editors in my own books, they have beat it into my head that semicolons are a big no-no. I once had an editor tell me that semicolons are for use in nonfiction, not fiction. So that kind of steered me in the direction of using them very sparingly.
Well, no, not really. Because my thing is, it's characterization. Some people talk like that. And while I would not have every character talking in semicolons, if you have one person, fine, let her have the semicolons and let everybody else have the periods, whatever. So anyway, this is the stage where it's really fine tooth polishing. And then after that copy gets sent back to me to read over. And honestly, I do not make mountains out of molehills. I read through the manuscript very quickly. And as long as I don't hit something there that there's been an obvious mistake, or there's a word I would just never use in my whole life, then I just let it go, because this is not the, and plus by this time I'm usually knee deep in the next book. So I'm sort of over it all. And then after that, I approve it or mention any changes that need to be fixed. And then it goes to proofreaders and copy editors. And sometimes, if it's nonfiction particularly, you might have fact checkers or even a legal team that's going to go over your manuscript. Some, if you're writing about something theological, it might go under a theological review. So anyway, the publishing house depends on what you're writing and what they require, and it goes through all those things. And then you are finally sent galleys. It used to be they would send you these huge sheets of paper, and it looks exactly as it's going to look once it's printed. But these days, they just send you a PDF, and it still looks like it's going to look when it's printed. And I always read it through very quickly again, because I know that there's proofreaders and copy editors and everybody else going through it as well. And then that's it. So yes, a whole lot of eyeballs get on that page.
And I feel like they don't always get their they don't always get their. Well, I know in my books, I always thank my editors, but I feel like they're kind of the unsung heroes of every book because they don't always get their,
day in the sun.
Yes.
Yes,
Day in the sun.
And they're invaluable, and it's their job to make the book as good as it can possibly be, and they truly do help. And I have people say, but it was perfect. I don't need an editor. And I'm like, oh yes, you do. Everybody does.
Never think your work does not need an editor. So
editing is important.
Has there ever been a time when like the editor wanted you to make a change on something and you're just like, I do not want to make that change? Like, do you have the flexibility to do that? Like, or can you just say, okay, well, I hear you, but I'm just not going to do that. Or I know your situation's a little bit different because they're paying you to write the book. So maybe you don't have that type of flexibility. How's that work for you?
Oh, yeah, you do. But you have to choose your battles carefully. For instance, one of my publishers has a computer program called Bad Word Pro. Now, this was many years ago, so maybe there's an improved version with a new name. But it caught a lot of, like I had a grandma who had a heaving bosom, and they made me change it to a heaving chest. And I was like, it just doesn't roll off the tongue like it should.
Doesn't really.
Yeah.
No. And in the same book, it was a contemporary novel, and the protagonist, who's a mom, has like a 4 or 5-year-old, 6-year-old kid, and they've been cooped up in the car for hours. And then suddenly the little kid screams, "There's fart particles in here." And she wanted to take that out. And I said, "Oh, please let me keep it." I said, "I know it's not language we use every day, but it's so appropriate for that age group, for a little boy, for kids who've been cooped up in the car." So she did let me keep it, but I did hear through the family grapevine that my aunt disapproved. So
I think we all have one of those in the family.
Girl, I know I do.
Melissa.
Melissa Brown, are you listening?
Yes. And I know it's not I know. I don't even like it when my grandkids say that, but kids are going to be kids, and we hear it. Yeah.
So Brett and I have talked about this in a couple of past podcasts. Actually, it's just very important that authors write children in a way that they sound like actual children. Otherwise, it just comes off as weird and you can't relate to it at all.
I hate it when kids sound like adults. That's just not normal.
No, it's not normal.
Yeah, I've read so many manuscripts at writers' conferences where somebody is writing a book for a child and they sound like little grown-up adults preaching to one another. And I always say, all right, my first recommendation is that you go spend some time with some kids. Yeah, or 2 or 3.
Exactly. Sometimes I'm just like, good grief, have you never spent time with an actual child? Because
for sure.
It doesn't sound like you have.
Yeah.
So let's switch over and talk about why we're here. You recently published your second book in the Emissary series called The Sisters from Corinth. Why don't you tell the listeners just a little bit about that one?
Of a Cinderella story, in that there's a family with stepsisters, and there's a handsome prince, except he's the son of the local governor in the Roman Empire, and Marcus. And so the cunning, secular, non-believer sister wants to marry him because she wants power, fame, and glory. And then there's a quiet, assuming Christian girl who just really doesn't care. In fact, she is pretty sure she shouldn't marry an idol worshiper. But of course, she's the one he falls in love with. And so they get married. But in the Roman Empire, you could divorce someone as easily as coming up and saying, I divorce you.
Oh, yeah. I noticed that in the book. Divorce seemed like a very common thing and easy thing in those days, which kind of surprised me.
It took me a little bit by surprise, too. But
you didn't realize that divorce
I guess I
was that
didn't.
common?
I guess I didn't. Yeah.
That was interesting. That was weird.
Yeah. I mean, they did not consider marriage for life at all. It was a foreign concept. So even though the good sister marries Marcus, that's not going to stop the ambitious sister, because she's like, marriage, you can change that in a heartbeat. And she's right. And so the rest of the book is her conniving and scheming. And I really don't see Prima, the ambitious sister, as an evil person. She did some evil things, but in her mind, she had very good reasons. And I learned this once through reading Dale Carnegie's book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. He said, every criminal justifies what they do so that it's right. And I never see my villains as evil in their own eyes, because I don't think human personality can deal with that. We always justify ourselves.
Yeah.
Well, the best villains think they're the hero in their own story. Mm-hmm. So the best fictional villains,
and they expect
fictional
to win.
villains,
always
think that they're in the right. Obviously in real life we don't want that, but Prima wasn't spoiled, a product of her time and being spoiled by her father, and rich, but I don't think necessarily evil because of that.
Yeah, and when after Marcus married Mariana, Prima found that her biological father's attention suddenly was all swinging in Mariana's direction. And so Prima was jealous and felt hurt and left out. And so there was a lot going on in her little heart.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was definitely a exciting read. I'm glad you said that, because I did not dislike Hector or Prima. I felt like they really made the story engaging. So, there's a lot of readers out there that kind of, they don't like the villains, but I kind of like villains.
And that they do.
They make life interesting.
I didn't like Hector.
Maybe not when it's happening to you, but, I did have one little silly question about when Mariana got married. The brides typically wear white. Mariana wore a orange veil. I thought that was kind of interesting. Was there some sort of historical
All
reason
the brides
for that?
wore orange veils.
What was that?
All right.
Really? Did you know that?
I wondered about that when I read it. I was like,
you've got to put this in your memory bank. This is important.
Yeah.
When do you think the tradition of wearing white for brides began?
In the Victorian era. Queen Victoria.
Really?
Yes.
That's right. Queen Victoria was the first one who did it. And that is relatively recent. So brides in biblical times, ancient times, they just wore their best dresses. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So was orange like the traditional color that they wore as veils, or like? Okay, so. Okay. So it wasn't like,
I didn't know that.
I think I'm going to wear red because I want to, it was usually orange. Okay.
Yeah, I think they wore orange for some reason that too, kind of if memory serves. But orange was the big bridal color.
Oh, interesting. That's interesting.
I didn't know that. I did notice that about the veil. I was like, I wonder if there's some significance to that. So it was good luck.
Good luck
for them.
Another interesting thing I learned in the book is that female gladiators are called gladiatrices.
Yes, I think it's gladiator. I can't pronounce anything. Gladiatrixes.
Did you know that?
I did not know. I knew there were some. I don't think there were a lot of them, though.
Woo! Something Melanie didn't know.
No, not very many at all. But there were some. I mean, they were constantly trying to find ways to make the games more exciting and more thrilling. And, it's because you get inured to violence. Look at us watching the movies we watched today. So, yeah, it's like, how many ways can we kill people? Yeah, sad but true.
Okay, I want to take a few minutes to talk about a review that someone left on your book, The Sisters of Corinth. Now, overall, it was a great review, 4 stars, I think. In the book, Mariana has a conviction about marrying Marcus because she's a believer in Yeshua, the true God, but Marcus worships the false Roman gods.
Right.
Mariana, as a believer in Yeshua, feels a conviction about marrying a non-believer, so she writes Paulos a letter. And for those of you who don't know, Paulos is what they would have called him back in their day, but today we know him as Paul.
Right. Okay.
She wrote him a letter asking his advice about marrying a non-believer, and eventually Paulos responds with a letter and gives her his advice. The reviewer made the comment that they didn't approve of Paul sending the letter to her because she felt that in doing so, you put words in Paul's mouth. I'm interested to know how do you respond to such a claim?
Well, my question is, where do you draw the line? Because if Paul's in the story, I have to put words in his mouth. And he does show up actually in the 3rd book. And so I put lots of words in his mouth. And Priscilla and Aquila, I had to put words in their mouth because they're part of the story. And when I wrote my Jerusalem Road series, Jesus made appearances and I had to put words in his mouth. But here's the thing. Whenever I put highly esteemed biblical characters in novels, I do try to be absolutely faithful to their characters. And so you'll probably notice that the letter that Paul does write to Mariana only echoes the things that we have in his actual letters.
Yeah. When I read the review, I was like, what? Because you actually used Paul's own words in the letter that he wrote to Mariana. He said things like live in harmony with everyone, which is in Romans.
Right.
Associate with all people, rich or poor, free or slave, which is also in Romans. Don't overcome evil with evil, but overcome evil with good, which is in Romans. And the most important one, if you have an unbelieving husband, don't divorce him, for he will be sanctified through your godly example. But if he leaves you, then let him do so, which is in Corinthians, I think. So I don't feel that you really put words into Paul's mouth because you used his actual words.
Absolutely.
So I think, again, that's the kind of things where as readers, we kind of have to look at the overall picture. So I just kind of wondered if you saw that and kind of, of course, as authors, we don't respond to stuff like that. But I just kind of wondered how reviews like that
nobody
kind of
likes a bad review or even a review that's critical. Yeah. But I always try to read these reviews and think, okay, is this person making a valid point? Did I really mess something up? And sometimes I just think, maybe this person, biblical fiction is not really going to be their favorite genre because you have to put words into characters' mouths.
True. You do. Otherwise, there are the Bible really gives us a small segment of those characters' lives. And so you kind of have to fill that story up. And again, that's why it's called historical fiction, biblical fiction. With fiction, you have to go into it with the understanding that there's going to be a little bit of
I always use this analogy. The Bible gives us like a pen and ink sketch, and it's the historical fiction and biblical times writer's job to fill that in, to color it, to add texture and sound, and to bring that pen and ink sketch to life. I'm working on a book about Sarah right now, and I found this ancient manuscript that has so much in it, and I'm going to use a lot of it. But I wrote an intro. It may change, but right now the intro on the first page, really where the epigraph should be, I wrote, whoa, I know what you're going to think when you're 20 pages into the story. The Bible doesn't say that. And then I say,
Yeah.
trust me, I found this ancient manuscript and I'm going to use it a lot. And it's not inerrant, but it might be very historical. So we're going to run with it. So anyway, that's the gist of it. I just thought, I
There
know
you go.
people are going to have that reaction.
Yeah.
I put a scene on my Facebook page the other day, and I had some comments about, where are you getting this? That's not in the Bible. And I said, no, but the Bible, we don't even hear about Abram until he's like 75 years old. He had a life before that. So yeah, a lot of life.
Yeah.
The whole life.
So,
for us.
So I figured, I'm going to prepare people up front. And if they aren't interested in reading fiction about, and I do promise never to contradict the scripture. That's the promise I make to my readers. But other than that, I feel like I have license as long as it's probable and true to the time.
Yeah. And I totally agree with that. When I go into a fictional book like that, I always know
sure
there's going to be an element of fiction to it, because the Bible would be 14 volumes long if we knew everything that everybody said. So, yeah.
Okay. So we've already talked about the fact Brett is he's not a huge fan of historical fiction. He's becoming a little bit of a convert. I have loved historical fiction since I can remember. Started with it, Little House on the Prairie, things like that. But I also love to watch it, and I'm a bit of a costume buff for period dramas, to the point where it bugs me when things are wrong. It's just, pin your hair up. Why is your hair down? That's the wrong corset. Why would you wear that? You didn't wear a corset in the Regents here. Just
Melanie has very strong opinions about things in movies.
I have very strong opinions, particularly costuming. You have a huge budget. Why aren't you getting it right? But anyway, I found it interesting, all the things you wrote about. You go into great detail with the clothing, with the hair, even with the descriptions of the settings. And I wondered, as I was reading, I wondered if it was difficult to find resources on things like that, because I've looked things up in libraries, but it's a lot easier to find stuff on, say, the Victorian or Regency or Edwardian eras than it would be to find something much older. This is very much older. So I just wondered if it was difficult to find those types of resources to pull information from, because you can tell that you spent a great deal of time looking into things like that, which we appreciate very much.
Yes.
No, it's not. All right, here's something. The book 3 is about a sculptor. And so I had to get into sculpting, and I discovered this fact. All right, all the ancient Roman and Greek statues we see, they're all usually like pure white marble, right? And the ruins of the buildings, the pillars, all pure white stone, right? In reality, they would have been painted garish colors, red, and these statues were completely painted. They have found microscopic, they study the stone, and there are tiny bits of paint flecked into the stone. What happened was time and the elements have taken all the paint off. And the Romans loved color, and the poor people couldn't afford to pay dyers, so they wore simple colors. Their tunics were, muslin and rough cottons and wools, so everything was pretty much au naturel as far as color goes. But the wealthy people could afford dyers, and they could get silk, and they would dye them, so their outfits were extremely, extremely colorful. And I think you read in that book that the prostitutes were required by law to bleach their hair blonde. And I think that's just so they would stand out. So if you were cavorting with a woman, you knew what you were cavorting with. And
yeah, and I bet everyone else did too.
Yeah, so did everybody else. But red was not the color of prostitutes, but it was an odd and unusual color. I mean, we're talking about Italian people. And so that's why Gilda was a slave from Britannia. So she had the red hair of the Scots and the Irish. And so Prima coveted it because she knew she'd stand out at this party.
I was struck by the elaborate styles that the wealthy women in both stories, the way they wore their hair. I was surprised to read that they literally sewed their hair into these elaborate fashions with needle and thread.
Pretty fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's because they didn't have bobby pins back then.
According to a lot of movies, neither did anybody else.
They didn't have bobby pins. They did not have brushes. They did have combs, those wide tooth combs you could stick in your hair to kind of hold it. So combs and sewing in all those, they'd do the curls on a curling iron, heated in a fire, and then they would sew it together with needle and thread, hopefully that matched your hair color, and to keep everything in place.
Huh. I thought that was so interesting. I was like, wow,
yeah.
Historical times are really interesting in a lot of ways because it's just so different than how we do things. So,
that scene where they're getting ready for the king is giving a ball, thing is one of my favorites because they were just laying there while they were painted and pripped and de-haired.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Painful.
Yes, and I don't remember exactly what some of the things they went through, but as I was reading it, I was like, "Wow, these women had to be tough to get to be beautified."
Things have not changed.
It's not much better.
It's not much better these days.
Not really.
Wow, these women were not
maybe a little better, but not a whole.
Yeah.
So. Tell us a little bit. We're going to start wrapping this up, but we've been on here for a while. You have a newsletter that you have that's targeted toward writers. And I know we do have some author listeners. Tell us a little bit about that.
Oh, sure. The older I get, the more I realize I want to pass on what I've learned. And I'm not one of those people who, when I teach, I spend hours talking about the muse and blah, 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 blah. I'm extremely pragmatic and practical. It's like you do this, and you do this, and you do this, and you do this. So I've put out a series of writing lessons, and they're very specific. So if you're having problems with point of view, you can get, a 30-page book that explains point of view instead of buying a book this thick that rambles about everything under the sun. So I also thought, I discovered Substack, and it's a great way to just put things out in small bite-sized pieces. So my Substack for writers, it's easy to find. It's just Angela Hunt, no space, .substack.com. And it's free once a month, or you can sign up for the paid subscription and you'll get a newsletter once a week, as well as access to the archives so you can look things up and forever and forever. And once I get 50 paid subscribers, I want to start having like Zoom meetings where people send in the first 3 pages of a manuscript and we edit it together.
That's
so
cool.
Anyway, that's something I want to do. And I think, just as a writer, we write our books, but I've really discovered fewer people are reading today than in years past. And honestly, frankly, we're all looking for ways to support our writing habit. So this is one way to do it. And at the same time, it helps me to also reinforce the young writers that are coming up. So, or maybe some old writers who have retired and now they finally want to write that novel that they've been thinking about. Yeah.
Okay. So if I remember correctly, there are 3 options that writers can opt into: a free one, and I think maybe 2 paid options. Is that correct?
Let's see, there's free, and then there's paid, and then there's founding member, which was you also get the video course. I have a whole video course with pretty much everything I know.
The middle tier is the one that I opted into, and it has some great information in it. I always look forward to seeing the emails. So if you're a writer listening and think it's something that might interest you, I highly suggest that you check it out. Angie, can you tell them one more time how they can find it online?
AngelaHunt.substack, substack.com. There it is.
Also, there may be listeners who are interested in looking you up online. Where can they find you on social media?
Oh, sure. Facebook. I'm very active on Facebook. It's Angela Hunt, novelist. And I'm on Instagram, but honestly, just very like a daily post, very simple. Most of the good stuff is on Facebook or the newsletter.
So we've thoroughly enjoyed both the books of yours that we've read.
For sure.
And I wondered, are there any other biblical historical fiction books out there that you could recommend? Any other particular, maybe books that you've read and enjoyed as well?
Well, the classic one you need to read is The Silver Chalice. I mean, it's old. But it's wonderful. The Silver Chalice, and also Pontius Pilate is very good, by Paul Mayer, I think. And The Silver Chalice, I think, is by somebody Chastain. But I think those were two of the ones when I was reading historical fiction coming up. I loved both of those novels, and they were great.
Mm-hmm. Oh, and who did you say that one was written by?
Chastain's. It may be Paul Chastain, but then again, maybe not.
The Silver Chalice. That should be easy.
I hadn't heard it. The first
That's
biblical historical fiction I ever read was The Red Tent. And
yeah,
I picked it up at the library, and I thought it was a Christian novel. It was not. Spoiler.
No. Yeah,
but it was in that era. It was in that era. But I've read several since then. Yours is one of the best I've ever read, though. So.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, there wasn't much. Two from Galilee by Marjorie Holm was huge when it came out, probably in the 70s.
See, I've heard of that. I don't think I've read it.
It was very good. It's the story of Mary and Joseph and the birth of Christ. That was a real trendsetter. But then, like I said, there's a pendulum when it comes to biblical fiction. It's hot, and then it's not. And it's hot, and it's not. Right now, it's hot. In 5 years, I'm betting not. So we'll see.
It's like, Lord, please let it stay hot for a while.
Yeah.
So what do you have coming now that you're done with the third book in the Emissary series? Can you give us just a little bit of a hint of what's coming after the Emissaries, after that third book publishes?
Well, I'm doing the matriarchs of our faith. So
you mentioned that.
Yeah, Sarah, and then Rebecca, and then Rachel and Leah. And actually, Leah has to be the one to tell the story because Rachel doesn't survive until the end. So, and after that,
it's true.
I'm not sure, but I will probably switch out of biblical fiction because, like I said, I've run out of people to write about. Unless
there's only so many people in the Bible.
Yeah, unless the Lord just sends me an idea that sets my hair on fire, I'll probably switch over to something else.
Yeah,
it's
Lord willing.
It's interesting to have something from Leah's point of view. She gets a little bit of a bad rap, and it wasn't really her fault.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I mean, I'm sure there were moments when maybe she wasn't very nice to Rachel, but it wasn't her fault. She did what her father told her to do.
Yeah. Well, there were moments when Sarah wasn't very nice either. So
that's true.
Yeah,
we're all human.
We are. We are.
You know, and sometimes I don't know if everybody else does this, but sometimes I sort of like romanticize like biblical times in my mind. You know, you think everybody's all nice and prim and proper. Mm-hmm. Well, in reading your books, I'm like, they were just as mean as people these days are.
There's nothing new under the sun, as Solomon wrote.
Yeah,
I read
they just dress differently.
In my book, Magdalene, Mary Magdalene, she goes with Jesus and blah, 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 blah. But something bad had happened to her in her past, and she hates the Romans. Now, nobody liked the Romans, but she hates them. And so she does something. And I've had people write me and say, she was perfect. She was a saint. She walked with Jesus. And I'm like, she was human. And
she was human.
Even those of us who walk with Jesus today can still, blow it majorly. So, yeah.
But thank goodness there's grace for those times, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And we can learn from their mistakes, which is the whole point of biblical fiction, I think.
Yeah,
exactly.
I know The Chosen's got a lot of blowback from the disciples being, they argue, and I'm watching them, and I'm like, it never occurred to me that they would do this, that they would argue, that they would make jokes with each other, that they would get around, but it makes sense. They were just people.
They were men. Yeah.
They didn't automatically, when they left their boats behind, they didn't automatically become saints. That's not how that works.
Yeah.
They,
but in my
they
mind,
walked
that's
with
kind
Jesus.
of how I picture them.
Yeah, they walked with Jesus.
Yeah, and they didn't even get the point of the death and resurrection until after the resurrection. So, yeah.
And that actually gives me a little sympathy for the people of the Bible days, because in the books, we see where characters are forced to come to terms with transitioning from atoning for their sins with the shedding of blood through animal sacrifices to atonement through salvation through Jesus Christ. It makes me think, imagine how difficult it must have been for those people who were suddenly being taught of this newfangled method of salvation. So I can understand their reservations with following this Jesus character,
It had to have been very difficult.
Yeah, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And they didn't have completed scriptures that we have. They didn't have Paul there to run to every minute that they had a problem. They were pretty much reliant on the testimony of those who had gone before, a few epistles that wandered through, and the Holy Spirit.
Yeah, true. And I have to say, even though historical fiction typically isn't a genre that I gravitate towards, I have to say that reading your books has given me a new appreciation for the genre. I'm actually reading a biblical fiction book by another author right now. So you've definitely whet my appetite for biblical fiction. So for that, thank you, Angie.
I'm impressed.
Somebody ought to be.
Oh, thank you.
And I actually have one of your contemporary books on my to-be-read pile. I can't remember what it's called. I think it has Wave in the title.
What a Wave Must Be. Really? Somebody's reading it?
They are. I'm in a Christian fiction readers group on Facebook, and several people in that group have mentioned loving that book. So I decided I needed to add it to my to-be-read pile.
It's about suicide. And, usually when I say, does anybody want to read this book about suicide? You can imagine the looks I get. But I'm glad people are reading it. I do think it's an important book. It's just a hard book to read, honestly. Yeah, hard subject.
Well, tough subjects don't bother me in books, so I look forward to picking up and reading it soon.
Shouldn't avoid tough subjects in books.
No.
Oh, good. Oh, I'm glad. That makes me happy.
Well, we have just really enjoyed having you on the podcast. Before we let you go, is there anything else you would like to say?
No, just thank you so much. I always enjoy talking to you too. So thanks for having me.
Since you were our first author interview, we consider you a friend of the podcast. Maybe we can have you on again after book 3 releases, which we're looking forward to quite a bit.
Oh, I'd love it. Thank you.
And finally, before we sign off here, for anyone who wants to follow us on social media, we are on Facebook and Instagram as Bookish Introverts Podcast. We'd love for you to follow us there. Also, if you want to email us, our email is bookishintrovertspodcast@gmail.com.
And I am trying to figure out how to get us a TikTok as well, if anyone wants to follow us on TikTok.
You are?
I am.
Oh, Oh,
I'm working on that.
I was on TikTok for about a week, and I decided it was too nasty and toxic for me. So good luck with that.
I use it for cute animals and babies and fan type stuff. So
oh, cool. Okay,
I don't know much beyond that.
That would be cool to have a presence on TikTok. So yeah. Well, so we'll keep you updated on that. Again, Angie, we thank you for coming on. It has been a pleasure to speak with you. Listeners, we also thank you for listening.
Yes, thank you.
And we will be back in 2 weeks for another great episode.
Yes, thank you.
Yes, we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks for joining us on the Bookish Introverts podcast, where together we explore the worlds within the pages. Until next time, stay bookish.